Much has been said about the learning of Rambam, the importance of it. And obviously, as Chassidim, Atakana is Atakana, Frierdiker Rebbe instituted Chitas, Chumash, Tilim, Tanya. The Rebbe instituted Rambam. But it's always good to think a little more of the importance of why. Why Dafka Rambam? And why Dafka in Tovshin Mem Daled? And Dafka by the Rebbe. So though none of us can know the Rebbe's kavanas, but the Rebbe spoke enough to tell us many different things. So I want to touch upon is a deeper look of why the Rebbe chose Rambam and what it means for us personally. Though we're going into the 40th year, Koy Inish Adaita the Rebbe. So there are things perhaps that we can discover now that we may not have fully appreciated back then, 40 years ago, 39 years ago. That can, above all, not just as insight, but take away a deeper appreciation and a deeper commitment. Everything has to come down to Maaseh B'Peil, a deeper commitment to this takana and in spreading it all over the world, which is what the Rebbe wanted. That was his intention. It shouldn't just be for Chassidei Chabad. It should be for Eden everywhere, of all kreisen, of all chugim, of every background. A Rambam for all people, for all Jews. But when you understand the importance of it, not just as a takana, gzeira gezarti, the Rebbe said to do so, it can add to the whole chayas and to the whole commitment and passion behind it. So it's always good to begin with a kasha, with a question. That's how Jews think. A question, especially if Chabad, we ask, we think chochma bina das, we try to understand things. So here's my question, my klotz kasha, so to speak. Chassidus Chabad, the Alter Rebbe instituted Chassidus Chabad, after Chassidus HaKlolis from the Baal Shem Tov and Magid. So that's true, the Alter Rebbe wrote a Shulchan Aruch Harav, but the main contribution of Chassidus Chabad is Kishmoi Keinu, Chassidus and Chabad. Shulchan Aruch is full with Chidushim. But you see, the main thrust of the Alter Rebbe, going through each generation, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe Marash, the Rebbe Rashav, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, though they're Ge'enim in Nigla, obviously, and taught Nigla and have Shuvas, but the main Chidush was Chassidus Chabad, Yefutzum and Esecha Chutza. As the Baal Shem Tov heard from Moshiach, that Osimar do Malka Mashiach, when there'll be the Yefutzum and Esecha Chutza. So it seems interesting that the Rebbe would choose Rambam, not learn Hemshech Hayim Beis or Samach Vov and be mechalik that to the whole, to everybody, or Tanya for that matter, though we have Chitas. So you could say, okay, not Tanya, but other things. Dafka something that is not Chassidus B'chlal. It's Nigla, and to the extent that there are even opinions that the Rambam did not know Kabbalah. There are opinions that he knew Kabbalah. There's an opinion that he only found out at the end of his lifetime. Another opinion that he always knew, but it was not his inyan to be Megalit. So there's a Ramozim that Agachova brings and other places. And there's an opinion that he didn't know. Not every Gadol B'Yisrael knew all Chalkei Torah. It's not a chsarden. It was everyone had their shlichus and tafkid. So why did the Rebbe choose Rambam of all things? And he connected it to Achdus, as I mentioned, Achdus Yisrael, all the Eden together learning, and Achdus HaTorah, because the Rambam, unlike Shulchan Aruch, also talks about Hilchas the Mashiach and also about the laws of Beis HaMikdash. In Shulchan Aruch, Eira Chaim, through Yeridea and Chesha Mishpat and Even Ezer, is all halachas that are shayochim shayach bizman hazeh. The Rambam includes all halachas. As he writes in his introduction, he's encompassing the entire Torah to the point that you don't need anything but Maaseh Torah Shebiksav and Mishneh Torah. And this is what the Rebbe chose. So can we move on? I'm not asking a question on the Rebbe. We accept everything the Rebbe, but it's interesting to see, can we understand it a bit? Did the Rebbe give us any hints? Or maybe more explicitly, why? And connected, as I said, also to the Geula. Because when you have Achdus Yisrael and Achdus HaTorah, Kol HaTorah Kula, by all Eden, that's the Keli for Geula Amitis V'Ashlema. As the Rambam is Messiah, talks about the Geula in Halacha too. The end of Hilchos Malachim, as we were just Messiah in Perikut Beis. The question gets a little more interesting. If you think about it, among Chugi B'Yisrael, the ones who really say, they claim that they, I can't say own, but that they are domain is Rambam, is the Yeshivas HaBrisk, Derech from Brisker, the Brisker Yeshivas. Reb Chaim Brisk was known as being a Gon in Rambam. The Brisker, of course, are an extension of Volozhin that goes back all the way to the Menagdim, to the Alter Rebbe. So Rambam, not Chaz Rishon, the Rambam is Menagid, but the Rambam is actually the domain of the Brisker. There's an interesting story they tell. Reb Chaim Brisk, had one of his friends happened to be a Chabad Chassid, a famous Chabad Chassid. His name was Reb Mendel Chaim. The story goes, they were once sitting and learning together or discussing, and Rambam came up. They were discussing different Rambam. And they were arguing, Pshat in this Rambam, Pshat in that Rambam. Rambam was such a central component in the Brisker Shitta. And in their disagreement, Reb Mendel suddenly says to Reb Chaim, what you're saying is a Rambam that Seiser, that contradicts what you're saying. Reb Chaim looks at him and says, listen, you're a Gon, I respect you, but the Rambam is somewhat our domain now. There's no such Rambam. Reb Mendel went out of the room, came back with a Rambam, the Rambam he was referring to, put it down on the table, and left the room. He left the room. The Reb Chaim looked into the Rambam, yeah, it was a Rambam Taka, Reb Mendel was correct. Later, Reb Chaim was a colleague and an ally in many areas with the Rebbe Rashab. They were the two big Dalim in Russia at the time. You know, the stories of the Asifas and their cooperation and respect. And Reb Chaim told the Rebbe Rashab a little while afterwards, he said to Rebbe Rashab, he knew that Reb Mendel was a Gon in Limud Torah, but he didn't know he was such a Gon in Midas Tevis. The fact that he walked out of the room, he didn't want to be there in any way to cause any form of shame or anything that. So, but nevertheless, that the Rebbe should suddenly, as one Brisker Talmud once told me, at Rosh Hashiva actually in Yerushalayim, he said to me, your Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, hijacked the Rambam from us. He stole the Rambam. I said, stole? The Rambam is for Kol Ali Eden. Adarabah, let's all learn together. But I know what he meant. I know that, just stick to your field. This is our field. And yet this is what the Rebbe did. So to add to the equation, so to speak, to add to the whole drama, the Rambam also was not a simple person. He was what we would call controversial in his time. First of all, because there wasn't technology and there wasn't communication as it is today, so the Rebbe Rambam was misunderstood by some. As a matter of fact, to the point he was dismissed. You may know that the Rambam, some of his Sfarim were burned. Some people saw the Rambam when they saw some of his writings, Meir Nevuchim, God of the Perplexed, and the beginning of Hilchos Yesod Torah. They saw it as somewhat a little enlightened. Their mistaken interpretation that the Rambam was a little more like a rationalist, citing philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy. So some dismissed it to the point they actually burned the Rambam's Sfarim. The Rambam was misunderstood, was not fully understood. It was the Ramban and other Gedalim, the next generations, that came and wrote a snatzels where they defended the Rambam, and Adarabah, they saw the godless of the Rambam. But still, as the Rebbe cited a number of times, I don't know if today, but there was a time where the first 4 prokim in Hilchos Yesod Torah were skipped in some yeshivas, because that was seen as the philosopher Rambam, not the Ish Halacha, the Bala Halacha of the Rambam. Obviously, when you think about it, the Rambam is a Rambam, a Gadol B'Yisrael, and even Meir Nevuchim, as the Rebbe described in so many different ways, which we're not going to go into, it's all part of the Rambam. And it became clear that the Rambam was misunderstood, but he was controversial. Ad kedei kach, if you look in the Rambam right now, printed in the Rambam, what comes right side by side with the Rambam, besides the commentaries? Hasogas HaRavid. Hasogas HaRavid. When you read them, not everyone, but quite a few, are a direct attack on the Rambam. Sometimes even a personal attack, with very sharp words, harsh words. Because the Ravid saw the Rambam and some things that he said, he completely disagreed. Not just Shammai and Hillel, a real strong disagreement. To the extent that when you read it, you say, what? Why would they print something like this? If today somebody wrote that on a Rosh Yeshiva, not even on the caliber of the Rambam, they'd excommunicate him. Mamish bezoyin in some issues. But it's printed. I tell very often, people tell me, people who question, they say, all you Jews, they're all so conformist, everybody's thinking the same way. Nobody has different opinions. I always open up, I said, let me show you something. I open up a Rambam with a Ravid, whether it's Hilchus Tshuva, the strong words there, or in other places, and I say, tell me, and I translate. If they know Hebrew, they don't know Hebrew. And I translate, I say, do you have any books like that where an author is completely attacked by someone and you print it and we learn both together, it's all part of Torah? It's the exact opposite. That's the Derech HaTorah. But it just goes to show how the Rambam was a man ahead of his time, if you want to put it this way. So how do we understand this whole thing? And going back, of course, to the main point that we're talking about here, Sima Rambam, the Rebbe instituted. And obviously, when Eifon HaLimud, and the way that should reach Ali Eden, 3 prakim of the day was the main takana. But the Rebbe also said, in case somebody can't do 3 prakim, 1 perik each day. So it concludes around once every 3 years, a little less. And even Sefer HaMitzvahs, for children or for others who are unable to keep with the halachas. You see the extent the Rebbe went to encompass everyone. So how do we understand this in context, especially Miftsoyim in the Lameds, in the Chofs and the Lameds, the Rebbe instituted the 10 Miftsoyim. Miftsoyim, the Rebbe is a Nasi B'Yisrael. He saw the need to be Me'ered Eden, especially so many who are assimilated. So the Rebbe saw that through these Miftsoyim, obviously the Gili of the Rebbe's Torah, Chassidus, and so on, is all in the line of Yefutzim and Chutzah, but Rambam, a takana like the Rambam. So, we don't have to speculate, we don't have to guess. The Rebbe Beferish did explain it a little earlier. Those familiar with the Rebbe's approach, and you see it, an interesting approach. Very often, before the Rebbe instituted something, he often would drop a remez, a hint. He would talk about it before, sometimes years before, until he came back to it. And the Rebbe sometimes even said, I was waiting, I was waiting for somebody to appreciate the hint I dropped, or the indication. So, Mem Dalet, Tavshin Mem Dalet, is preceded 9 years earlier, was Tavshin Lamed Hey. Tavshin Lamed Hey, I remember this, I was a bocher in 770, and the Rebbe was Yutes Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Hey, Rosh Hashanah of Chassidus, and the Rebbe began, as his custom was on Yutes Kislev, his Chalukas Hashas. So the Rebbe would make a siyum on a Masechta. What Masechta the Rebbe choose in Yutes Kislev, Tavshin Lamed Hey? Masechta Tomid. Tomid. And the Rebbe started a siyum, Kedarki B'Kedesh, questions, back and forth, explanations. Then suddenly, they transitioned into V'yeshlika to connect it with Siyum HaRambam. No obvious connection. It's not like the Rambam, because Tomid quotes the Rambam, it means there's no direct connection. The Rebbe started connecting to Siyum HaRambam. So I remember listening to it, okay, the Rebbe Yeshlika. It's not uncommon, you connect it. But then started a whole new parsha. I think it's maybe one of the longest, if not the longest sikha, uninterrupted by Nigunim that the Rebbe delivered. I don't remember the length, maybe an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours even. But I remember it went on and on. If the Rebbe was a Mayan HaMizgaber, this was a Mayan HaMizgaber Shemizgaber. On, and not a perverter. In-depth analysis of the Siyum HaRambam, then he connected to Ascholos HaRambam, connected to Yutes Kislev, connected to Masechta Tomid, connected basically to Kol HaTorah Kula. The Rebbe's approach, Achdus of Kol HaTorah. And it was very profound and very complex, to the point, I remember afterwards, I was already getting involved in the Fabrengens and Sichos. Afterwards, that Shabbos afterwards, Pasha Vayeshev, Shabbos Vayeshev, Shabbos Miketz. Questions went in, and the Rebbe, you could see the koch was tremendous. It was one of the most, the Rebbe koch sich and everything, but this was on a different scale. And questions and answers and questions and answers, all those weeks, to the point that year, in Hapardis, in the Kovetz Hapardis, released by Gudus Haraborim, Rav Simcha Elberg, Olav Shalom, was the Erech, was the editor. The Rebbe edited a part of the Sikha that was published in Apartis. Didn't edit it once. He edited 5 times. It was up there. Rabbi Yael once told me more than even in Yonah Teres Achsidis how much the Rebbe edited. One of the interesting things, which sets the tone for what I want to share with you, is that the Rebbe insisted that even though he connected the ideas with concepts in Chassidus, but everywhere there was a hint of a Chassidus Shaloshin from Chassidus in the Pnim, in the actual text of this Hadran. The Rebbe said everything in footnotes. Chassidus, Mokedus, Chassidus, and language, it should only be in the language of the Rambam of Halacha. That was the Rebbe insisted. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole Hadran, but this was a Hadran. And afterwards, it's not like the Rebbe made the takana to learn Rambam the next month or the next year. It was 9 years. This was Yutas Kisul Lamed Hey, Achar Shapesach, Mem Dalet, more than 9 years later. But when you look back, you start seeing a pattern. They say, I don't know if there's a Mokkah, they say when the Rebbe was in Paris even, he would learn Rambam every day, some people said. And they say in the time of the Magid, there was Rambam. There were connections, but you never really fully appreciated it. Now, what is the Nukud in this Hadran? Which I believe that when you look into it, you see what the Chiddush of the Rambam is even more than meets the naked eye. What's the Chiddush among the different Chiddushim? There's a lot of Chiddushim. The Rebbe begins and explains the first 2 halachas in Rambam. You say the Vamud HaChochmes, Leida Sheyesh Motzei Rishon, which is the basic belief, obviously, Bereishis Bara L'kim Sashmayim V'Sa'aretz, that God created. God is the Motzei Rishon. He's the first cause, the source of everything. Who Mamse called Nimtza? We call him Nimtza Mishamayim V'Eretz Masha Bereim Le Nimtza L'Mamitis Himotz. Okay. Then comes halacha 2. V'im Yala Adashu Ein Motzei Ein Dover Echad, or some say Acher Yochli Motzes. Im Yala Dashu Ein Motzei. And I remember the Rebbe was like incredulous. He said, "What kind of statement is that in halacha? That what Shahu Ein Motzei, that God doesn't exist? Why would there even be such a havamin? The Torah never says there's a havamin. But it's an axiom. It's a given. You say Ramud Echad She Yesha Motzei Rishon. Since when do we consider that God doesn't exist? Come on, let's not. And the Rebbe in Diuk HaLashon, since the Rosh Rambam is Tzacho Bruda, everything is precise, as we know. What means Yala ala Das? Yala? And Aliyah and Das? Should have said, Im Yimtza Adam, there's a lot of ways to say it. A Kasal Kadait, that you're going to negate. What's Yala ala Das? Among other questions. And the Nakuda of the Rebbe's answer is so revolutionary when you think about it that you realize immediately that Rambam on a completely different level. It's one of the things that is so understood once you understand the Rebbe's pshat, you start wondering how did anyone else learn it in a different way. What did the Rebbe say? The Rebbe, and of course, I should add one more question. What's all this negate to halacha? It's a sefer halachas. It's not a sefer of chkira. It's not a sefer of proving God's existence or the nature of God's existence. That's Meir Nevuchim or other svarim. This is sefer halacha. Everything is halachas here, which of course comes to challenge those that decide not to learn the first 4 prakim. It's halachas. What's the halacha here? So the Rebbe answered, B'kitzur, and the Rebbe answered, and again, only in the language of the Rambam. We'll soon connect it to the language of Chassidus. What does the Rebbe say? That when you're dealing with a sefer of halachas, there's a first fundamental principles that have to be put in place. The Eibishter created a world, Motzei Rishon, fine. Created a world. Now he says, go ahead and take the world, the chefza of this physical world, and turn it into something that the Torah says what you should do with it. An esrik, on the sukkahs, there's a certain thing. You mekadosh the esrik, becomes now a mitzvah. Some things are tashmishe mitzvah, some tashmishe kedusha, some are chefza shel kedusha. You can turn chayil into kodesh. It's essentially what halacha comes to direct us how to take a world. You call it a raw, unshaped world that God created, Shabara Lakim Lases, and how you should make Lesakin. La'ovdo L'shamret, how you align the world to what the Eibishter wants. Okay, very clear. That's the whole basis of halacha. That's why you need to learn halacha. What does halacha tell you to do? Hamaisa sheyasun, the ela shaleta sena. Because on our own, we wouldn't know how to behave in this world. Not everything is obvious. So we have Torah, halacha, that tells us this is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're not supposed to do. Here are all the nuances. And it takes area by area, whether it's Hilchas Yisei Torah, then there's Hilchas Deis, and then there's Hilchas Talmud Torah, Sefer Av, Krishma, Tefillah, and you go on and on. Each one of the Yudalit Sfarim of the Rambam covers another area of the Torah. That's halacha. But there comes an obvious question. How do you have the power to change the world that God created? The Eibishter created Chayil as Chayil. How could a human being, we ourselves are Nivroim, how can we take a Nivra and change it? If you're talking about like before Matan Torah, where you didn't change the world, so good, you're bringing in a certain level of Lakus, a certain level of Kedusha, of Göttlichkeit. But you're talking about turning Torah, you're taking a klaf, parchment, that comes from the hide of an animal in the wild, and you're turning it into klaf of Iver Stam, of Sefer Torah, Tefillah, or Mezuzah. You're turning it into Kedusha forever. It's changed. You've changed this object. You no longer can ever throw it out. It always will be Kaddish. When the Beis HaMikdash was built in the Harabayis, it forever changed that mokim. Kedusha le'zazimim came. How could a human being, through human actions, change a world that is created by God? God made the boundary between Chel and Kedesh. We didn't make this boundary. You can't suddenly come and change. You could change it superficially. So the Rebbe says, comes the second halacha and tells you how you can do it. Because Yala al Adas is not to say that God forbid there's no Eibishter. Im Yala al Adas hu ein motzei, that the Eibishter is beyond being a motzei. The Eibishter is beyond being an existing source. Motzei means he relates to existence. Motzei, memenu nimtzu kol nimtzoyim. There's some relationship between. Obviously, he's the creator, we're the creation. But im yaladashu ein motzei means he's not even in the geder. He's not even in the domain, in the realm of a creator. So nothing else exists because nothing else matters. That means God that chose not to relate to existence. For Eibishter to create existence, he has to relate to it. He has to want it. That will makes a relationship. So that explains how halacha can be God's will, the Tzenish Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, God's will, how to bring godliness into this world. But the Ein Motzei teaches us another thing. Because the Eibishter is beyond existence, therefore he can give us the power through Torah and halacha to change existence. You cannot change a system from within a system. You need to be able to go back to the engine room. Because once the Eibishter wired things, we say, for example, in the Gemara says that the zivug is kosher kekriyas yamsuf. What's kosher kekriyas yamsuf? Well, the Eibishter is difficult for him to make kriyas yamsuf. Why is it kosher? What's difficult? He created water, he created land, and then he decides to separate the water, and it should become like land, that the Jews can walk through it. What's the kosher? So the answer is, because the Eibishter himself bound himself, the pasuk lo yushbesu. Once he created the rules for existence, he does not defy them. He himself binds himself. Kemuven he could. Kol yochel, Eibishter can do whatever he wants. But even Kriyas Yamsuf, which is a nes gole, not a nes melubish beteva, an open miracle. Then what the Eibishter sent a wind, and the wind held up the water, like a wall. What the Eibishter needs tricks? He wants to, he just says, just like he says, he could say, the water spread and let them walk through it. Why the Eibishter have to use all these methods? Because the Eibishter himself does not defy his own structure. So the only way to change existence requires a level of Ein Motzei to be able to change. So the Rebbe says, in every halacha, there's two aspects. One is the power to change something, that comes from Ein Motzei. And the second is the power to be mamshich, Getlichkeit, and mamshich Ratzon Hashem in the object. And that's Motzei. And that's the language that Rebbe insisted on using. And when they in his edits, he would not allow them to use a language that if you used it, anyone who learned Chassidus would right away understand. The Malak Halalmin is Motze. That's a lakus, that's Milubish Ba'elamis. That has the power to bring Mamshich Lakus into the world, to bring godliness. But it doesn't have the power to create Yesh Ma'ayin, and doesn't have a power to create from Yesh back to an Ayin, meaning taking a Gashmizdika thing and turning it into Kedusha. There you need Einamotze. You need a power of Elokus. I'm now using the language of Chassidus that's higher than existence. That power, with that power, we can go into existence and rewire it. And that the Rebbe goes on to explain how mitzvah sesa, mitzvah leisesa, chiyuv, and shlila in every mitzvah. That's why the Rambam, so first of all, it answers the question, in Yala ala das, it's an aliyah. It's takan aliyah. Not any motzei chazrushom legriyusa, lemal yusa. He's beyond existence. And therefore nothing else can exist. Therefore that, when you invoke that, that gives the power to transform existence. And it's negate halacha, because this is the yesod of halacha. The Rambam is explaining how halacha changes the world. Everything in the Sefer Rambam is halachas. This is not a discussion about God's personality and how God level, whether he's motzei or ain't motzei. It's a negate halacha, because you must have motzei and ain't motzei for halacha to be chal in reality. I remember in Tovshin Chof, there's a Rishima, the Rebbe had college students came to see the Rebbe. Rabbi Dr. Yitzchak Block brought them. They had the Yechidus college students. They asked a lot of questions. It was later edited by the Rebbe. And one of the questions they asked the Rebbe was if a Rebbe can perform miracles. So the Rebbe answered the following. He said, they asked whether the Rebbe could perform miracles. So the Rebbe said, I can't vouch for what other people say about me, but let me explain to you the dynamics of a miracle. The Rebbe says a miracle is not as irrational as it seems. If you have a structure of a machine that's working, and you're able to go back to the wiring of the engineer that wired the machine, you can rewire it. So everything in this physical world, that Rebbe says, comes from a spiritual forces. If you can go to the spiritual forces and rewire them, it'll change the physical reality. That's what a person who does a nes sachakal. Then at the end of the Yechidus, the Rebbe said, now, if you leave tonight from this room, and each of you adds and increases a good deed, I will have performed a miracle. Later, the Rebbe, when he edited, he took out I, and he wrote, we will have performed a miracle. Okay, however you interpret that. But the point of the matter is, interesting way of understanding the dynamics of a miracle, of a nes. Not just someone does a miracle. It's going into the source, into the Ein Motzei in this language, and rewiring it from the same place that created it can also say, here's how you can rewire it. Which of course is the Chiddush of Matan Torah, according to Chassidus explains. They gave us the Keyach, because the Keyach HaAtzmus, that gives us the power of Ein Motzei to be able to go, or the power of Sefer Kalalman, to actually transform the world. Not just to bring a Gili Eir. It's one thing to bring light where there's darkness. Another is to transform the darkness into light. To transform a Chefzer Shel Gedusha, a Chefzer Shel Chel, to a Chefzer Shel Gedusha requires the Ein Motzei. Okay. This is the Kuda I wanted to share from Tavshin Lamed Hey. Now you say, what does this negate to anything? It's negate to everything. Because now the connection to the end of the Rambam is what? That when we use halacha, which is the Kol Sefer halacha is, just like the beginning of the Rambam told us what the tools and instruments we have. We have the koyach of the motzei. We have the koyach of the Ein Motzei. What happens when we taka implement it all? So we transform this world. The world becomes transformed into what? Like the last pedic of the Rambam, a world which is lo ye'esa kol ha'elam el dasas Hashem bulvad. Again, das, leda, das, yalala das. That the world is transformed. There will be no lekina v'lei sachrus le'rov v'lei melchame. Kimola orez deis Hashem k'mayim layom mechasim. From Yeshaya, the Rambam quotes. What's mola orez deis Hashem k'mayim layom mechasim? It could have just said, Kimo Lord is Deus Hashem. That the world be filled with divine knowledge. Kimayim le'yom echasim. That the earth itself, the world itself, the Yam, will be completely submerged like the bed of the ocean with water. So it's transformation, not just gilui, not just bringing godliness and godly knowledge and godly mitzvahs into this world. It's transformation of the world. So Molad Deus Hashem, K'mayim Liyam Achasim, is a result of Motzei and Eini Motzei working together through halacha to change the actual world in which we live. In a nutshell. Now, to make the point really clear, I happened to notice after, I don't remember when it was, maybe Lamed Zayin, a few years after Lamed Hey, the Rebbe then edited the Sikha more. There's a beginning, there's an end. It came out in a Kuntras. Hadran of the Rambam Lamed Hey, the classic of classics. This is all before the Takana. Around, I think Lamed Zayin, Lamed Ches, I happened to be looking at a Sefer, a book written by Harav Yasher Ber Soloveitchik, a grandson of Rab Chaim of Brisk, whose domain is Rambam. His sefer is called Ish HaHalocha, and it was then translated in English, the Halachic Man. And briefly, here's what he says. He says he always wondered why the school of Volozhin, and then followed by the school of Brisk, did not embrace the approach of the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe's approach seems to be B'chlal Masayim, Nister and Nigla. Shulchan Aruch, Harav, but also Nister, Tanya, and Chassidus. It seems like a perfect combination. Why did they reject that? The Nister part. And he said, being a student of Brisk and a family of Brisk, he's coming to defend and explain his parents, grandparents, and ancestors. And he says the following, because they felt that for the Hamein Am, for the average person, Ein lana esek b'nistaris. We can't figure out what's going on behind the scenes in the engine room, using the example I said before. We are told to be a ish ha'alocha. You have a yad, a hand, it should be a yad mechalekes tzedakah. Make sure it's a hand that gives charity. You have legs, have erotz ledvar mitzvah, run to do a mitzvah. You have a mind, focus on learning Torah, fuse with God's mind. You have a heart, chesed, do chmils chasodim, tzedakah. Every part of the human body should be aligned with the Ramach mitzvah sesa, salis mitzvah leisesa. The halachic man. We should be a walking Shulchan Aruch, basically. That's the kavanah. To align ourselves to what the Eibishter's Ratzon and mitzvah is. What goes on in Hechad Elamis, in Elamis Al Yenim, the Yichud of Zah Malchus, or the Amshach of Atzilus and Tibiyah, or the connection between Keser and Atik and Arich to Ak, or Lifnei Atzimtzum, or Lachar Atzimtzum. It happens, but it's not something we have to learn. So we have to be a Ish HaLoch. So here is a Yesh Lemer B'derech Efsher. And obviously everybody can feel to agree or disagree. So I said to myself, a light bulb went off. I said, 1 second here. I can't say that the Rebbe was referring to that, but it seems very uncanny that the Rebbe's Sikha actually, of Lamed Hey, actually is a response to Rabbi Yasher Ber's thesis. What is the Rebbe saying? The Rambam, your Rambam, the Rambam you kochzechin. I'm not quoting Chassidus. I'm not quoting Chabad. I'm not quoting the Alter Rebbe. I'm quoting the Rambam. The Rambam, as a sefer of halacha, talk about Isha halacha, says clearly that just to be a halachic man by following Mamala Kalalman in language of Chassidus, Motzei is not enough. If you don't connect to Ein Motzei, you can't perform halacha properly because you can't change existence. So the Rambam in Sefer Halachas, not in Primis HaTeirah, in Sefer Halachas, the Rambam is demonstrating the necessity for Ein Motzei, which is only in the domain ultimately of learning Primis HaTeirah. So to say that we are only going to deal with Motzei, Halacha Aleph, and not Halacha Beis, is eliminating, God forbid, you say this is a fundamental principle in halacha. Again, in halacha, not in theology and in primis atera, in halacha. Since I had the opportunity to write questions to the Rebbe, it was one of my schus in the merits when we wrote Fabrengens, we had the schus. Well, and I have to tell you, I took advantage of it fully, to the best of my ability, because I felt you could write to the Rebbe, darf man schleppen, was mer? Obviously, whatever you can take out of the Rebbe. One of my regrets is I wanted to ask the Rebbe this question. I don't think the Rebbe would have answered. Most likely would not have answered that he's responding to that. But I've written, obviously I wouldn't write such a question in that language. I always wanted to know whether the Rebbe's answer is also an answer to that approach. Regardless, it definitely is gishmak in my opinion, if I may say so myself, because it demonstrates something much more fundamental here. So the Rambam, therefore, the Rambam is not just a learning another shir jeden tog. It's actually, the Rambam is a bridge between Nigla and Primius, but it's all in the language of Nigla. It's all in the language of Loshen HaTeira that Klal Yisrael learns, but it carries in it actually the hechrech to learn Primius HaTeira. I'll share that Chagav, a story that happened with me. When I was bar mitzvah, I went into Yechidus, and I went with my parents, and the Rebbe asked me what I'm saying by the bar mitzvah. So I said, I'm saying a pilpul. So the Rebbe said, since you're bar mitzvah 13, I'm going to ask you 13 questions. And among the different questions, most of them were pretty simple. The Rebbe asked me which sugya. So I said, the Menocha is the sugya of that Laila loves man tefillin too. Why you don't put on tefillin by night? So interesting what happened. The 12 questions are basic questions. One question, the Rebbe asked me, so why taka don't you put on tefillin by night? So there's two reasons. One is Agzeres Sakos or Yomam Yemima, or the reason Al Pisechel is because Laila's loves man tefillin. Because by night you can fall asleep, and there'll be Heschadas, and it's a bezoyin for the tefillin. So we don't put on tefillin by night. The Rebbe asked me the following question. My birthday is Hey Tevis. So it's middle of the winter. In New York, it's like, what? The Rebbe looked out the window and said to me, Vifla Zeger vet Nacht die Tag. So what time does it get dark? So I said, I don't know, 5 o'clock, 5:30. The Rebbe said, the Veist Emitzvah was geht schlafen 4:30. You know anyone that goes to sleep 5:30? I said, no. So he says, if I was all the Teira nicht losna iden legen tefillin dieser Sach später. So I said, leit plug, wir können nicht mechalik sein, was ist da Nacht? Machten die klar, Nacht, so da Menschen was gehen schlafen früher, später, und in Winter, it's 5:30, but in Sommer, it's 9:30. I basically said that to start making distinctions when night begins, every place in the world is different, the time zones, there's also summer and winter, and different people go to sleep. So the Torah makes, so the Rebbe looked at me and went to the next question. Then he came back. He says, did you think over the first question? Rethink it? So I started bulbing the same thing. I started saying the same thing. The Torah doesn't want to. So the Rebbe said, ich verstehe nicht. You're telling me that the Torah is going to deprive a Jew for hours and hours of shibud haleva hameach, of connecting the mind and the heart, which is the kavanah in film, because it's just because it got dark. There's hours and hours. He could have found a way to be mechalik. The Rebbe refused to accept my answer, and of course for good reason. At the end of the Yechidus, the Rebbe says, "Es fragen dein Rosh Yeshiva, und efshe veter wissen." So that's what I did. I started asking. I asked my Rosh Yeshiva then I was by mitzvah, was Rabbi Marlow, Alav Shalom. Then there were others. I've asked the question by many people. And I get the same answer. Just recently, I think I came to the answer, which I think is just, it's really just the chvivusa de milsa. I'm sharing it. I was learning in the Kisvei Arizal. He says, why is Laila loves man tefillin too? Not because you go to sleep. He says the other way, why do you go to sleep by night? Hagufakash. Because by night is durmita de zah. In Ruchnius, when the sun sets, there's a certain slumber, a certain spiritual cosmic sleep the world goes into. We know the story with the Alter Rebbe that he would fall asleep Friday afternoon because he was dugma shalamayla, because that's a time where the world is going into a type of sleep. We say the same thing Rosh Hashanah by night. Alter Rebbe and Ageres HaKedesh Simin Yudal. So the Rebbe, and this is just a thought, maybe the Rebbe was trying to emphasize to me that you can't really answer this al pin nigla. You're going to have to come to some pnimius. So derech hagav, other yeah, the nisht, I'm just sharing this. Getting back to this, so what do we come away with? That the Rambam in Loshen HaNigla, in Loshen Halacha, as I said before, maybe the Rambam didn't even know Kabbalah, but he explains the idea in Halacha that from Halacha Dika Asius, even in Brisker Asius or Asius from Yeshiva world, that what? In the Elam HaTeira, as they call it, that you can understand that you must have levels of the Eibishter that's higher than Motzei. The language of the Rambam, Eine Motzei. Language of Chassidus, Sevav Kalalmin, and even higher than that. That is necessary in Halacha. Once the Rebbe made that, established that, in Tov Shalamed Hey, then you think about the Takon of the Rambam in Mem Daled now, 9 years later. And it's not a surprise, as I said many times, the Rebbe, 9 years later, what do you have? The Rebbe comes out with that Takona. I remember it was Achim Shal Pesach. I actually wrote it up right the next day after Yom Tov because they wanted to print it in the newspaper. And the Rebbe was Magia immediately. The Takona, and he came out. So he's being Matzia. The idea of learning Rambam every day with the reasons Avis Achdus HaTeira. He brings Kol HaTeira and Achdus Yisrael. So I went back to the Sichos of how the Rebbe explains it. So perhaps, if you think about it, it is a true Rambam revolution. The Rebbe, of course, explaining that we're in the Deir HaShvi, Ikvis of the Moshiach, in Ikvis of the Moshiach, the Deir HaShvi, coming close to the Geula, which means after thousands of years of work, of Torah mitzvahs, of implementing and executing halacha in this Gashmizdika world, the world is close to the process of actually being transformed to be a Dira B'Tachtenim. So it makes total sense that to use the Rambam, to learn the Rambam every day, uniting all the Eden, which is a Yisod in preparing the world for Geula, uniting Kol HaTeira, which prepares the world for Geula, and through what? Through a Rambam, whose whole Yisod is halacha, is world global transformation. It's not just another Sefer, not just a Sefer Kol HaTeira Kula. The whole Sefer is coming to teach us how we go into Elam Hazeh and we transform it with Motzei and Eine Motzei, with the Koyach of the Motzei Rishon and the Koyach of Yalal Adasa Eine Motzei. So it fits completely into the theme of what Chassidus is. Adarab, even more so. Chassidus does it through Primis HaTeira. In a way, it's still a shtickle Mamayla Lamata. Here you're taking halacha itself, Nigla itself, which is Asik in Yonim Elam Hazeh. The Alter Rebbe brings the Raya Mehemna, from the Raya Mehemna, in Simach Chavav and Ageres HaKedesh. The Raya Mehemna says there that the difference between Nigla and Primis is that Nigla is Eitz Adas, Tevara, and Primis HaTeira is Eitz HaChaim. As the Alter Rebbe, how could you call Teira Eitz Adas? Chas v'sholem. Tevara? So he says, because it's Asik in Tevara. When you learn Chassidus, when you learn Primis HaTeira, there's no Tevara. It's not talking about Taina Shel Sheker, and Reuven says this, and Shimon says that, and it's dealing with Tuma and Tara and Kedesh and Chayil. Chassidus and Primis HaTeira and Chassidus talk about Elokus. Everything is God. Yes, there's talk about Klippas, but Klippas is also the way godliness is concealed. What is Nigla the Teira Esikin? The nitty-gritty of this world. Where a person comes and says, I taina this and this one tainas that. And you have dealing, is this a muter or osir? Is it allowed or not allowed? Posha dealing with physical reality. Which is why Nigla is so important, because it's the birur hatacht in the language of Chassidus. The language of Nigla, that's what halacha does. It gives clarity of what the Eibishter wants, what's allowed, what's not allowed. That's how we transform the world. So we're better to do it through the Rambam, the epitome and the personification of Nigla and the world of Nigla, and demonstrating that part of the Teira is also united with Primis HaTeira in its objective. So everyone who thought the Rambam, everyone said the Rambam, where's the Rambam? The Rambam is the farthest thing from Primis HaTeira. The Rambam is a rationalist, ish halacha, everything is halacha. Even the philosophies of the Rambam are al pid seichel ha'nivra. etc., etc. Comes the Rebbe, especially in the first two halachas rather. In the general, the first 4 prokim. And then the end of the Rambam, and you look at it this way, you see a whole different reality. I don't know if you remember the first time the Rebbe made a siyum was Achar Shapesach Mem Hey. That was the first cycle. The Rebbe made the siyum on Yud Aleph Nisan. And he had the Rambam with him. If you remember, he took out the Rambam, he opened it, was reading it. In the rare times the Rebbe read inside. And I remember when the Rebbe was reading Mola Oris Deus Hashem Kamayim Le'Mechasim, he was like learning it like you learn with children. Every word, Mola. And the Rebbe types it like he types with Rashi. And that's what the Rebbe said. Mola Oris Deus Hashem Kamayim Le'Mechasim is transformation. Not just a Gili Elikus, not just Am Shach. That the world becomes Kamayim Layom Mechasim. So, what more appropriate way, as one of the shlovim, one of the steps toward Geula, which is the whole purpose of your Futzah Ma'anesecha Chutzah, is to demonstrate how it all is there, right there, in Torah, in Nigla, in Halacha, in the Rambam. So we look at it that way, the learning of the Rambam, and the cycle of learning, the daily learning of the Rambam, no matter what way you go, whether it's the 3 prokim a day, 1 perik, or Sefer HaMitzvahs, is all part of the process. The Slapshus in Nigla, in Halacha, of bringing the Geula, which of course is the whole matara of the Deir HaShvi. It's not just a takon. In that context, it takes on a whole different meaning. It means that the Rebbe, like in all areas, everything that Rebbe introduced was all about preparing this world, the finishing steps, the finishing touches of, as the Rebbe said, Tzu puts in the kneplach, or already Tzugi puts the kneplach. I want to add one thing, the interesting thing that, since it's Inyan and Rambam, in Tovshin Mem Daled, that same year actually, before Pesach, the Rebbe said something in a Fabrengen, I think it was Mishpotim Mem Daled. Almost sure it was Mishpotim, yeah. The Rebbe said that he was talking about learning Tanya on the radio, actually. Around that time, the Rebbe would speak about Rabbi Weinberg. Rabbi Shalom would learn Tanya on the radio. The Rebbe would speak about the significance of that. So he was talking about technology, radio, that it's really called Mashabara Kodesh Baruch Hu to say that it was created by any L'umazeh. You can use it for the wrong things, just like you can use Zov, gold, for the wrong things. But will God destroy his world because some people are using it the wrong way? And he's explaining how technology is a koyach adir, the Eibishter implanted in the world. There's a sikh mishpotim memdal that Rebbe was magiyat to a lot of his sophists, Ksaviyat. One of the things that Rebbe said there, he was talking about the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that nothing, Chaz v'sholom, that anything can be created by anybody but the Eibishter. You can't say something's created by Lumas. But then he brought what it says in Sanhedrin, we see, a machashif. There are those, a kishuf, not magician, not a chizis enayim, not the sleight of hand, that actually have the power, ivra kedibra, that they can create something. So the Rebbe spoke then and said, Kiyodua, as nochen zman harambam mishenishtokem machashv. There's no more kishuf. There's no more shadim and no more kishuf v'chulu. That's what the Rebbe said. I remember, I said, 1 second. That's a big chiddush. Where does it say such a thing? We know in Sefer Zechrenis from the Frierdiker Rebbe, it says even in the time of Baal Shem Tov, there was a shin dalads. So not that the Rebbe could say the chiddush, but what's the yesod of it? So then I thought that maybe the Rebbe was referring to, since the Rambam Paskins in Halacha, he writes that he's mevatel the whole union of kishuf and shindalids and so on as being shtusim. He writes clearly that's nonsense. So the Rebbe was saying that since the Rambam wrote that, well, after the Rambam, there's no more such a thing. So I asked the Rebbe, I wrote to the Rebbe at Tzatl, and the Rebbe answered, yes, lafushi machlekes as much as possible. There's still a machlekes. Before the Rambam would say there isn't, and others say there is. But lafushi machlekes as much as possible. Yesh lemer, you could say after the Rambam there's no more, so therefore everyone agrees there's no more. The Rambam says it for his reasons. But I threw into the Rebbe a question which I wanted to really get an answer. I did not get the answer. I had heard once that the Rebbe said, the famous machlekes between the Rambam and the Maral. The Rambam says in many places, Hu Hamada, Hu Yidei, Hu Yidur. Talk about Das. That's how Elokus is mislabish in Das. And Hu Hamada, Hu Yidei, Hu Yidur. He's the knower, he's the knowledge, and he's the knowing everything. We have a Yidiyah L'chutz Atzma. You know there's a table, you know there's a chair. It's not within you, it's outside of you. Comes the Maral, famous Maral, and says, what do you mean? Lav iu inu midus idu klal. The Eibush is not defined by Das. He's beyond Das. That's machshava tfisa beklal. And Chassidus is metavich in Tanya, in a number of places, in Perek Beis, in Hagah, and other places, that the Rambam is talking about Das and Atzilus. Das as it relates to existence. There, the Eibush is one with it. But if you talk higher than Ishtalshlus, he's higher than Das. That's the Tivuch. So I once heard that the Rebbe said in Afabrengen before the Nesiyas, before Tovshin Yud, that perhaps you can say that the Rambam was Chassidus says Shammai is Gvura, Hillel is Chesed, and that's why Hillel's halachas are more lekula, and Shammai legvura is more leisur, lechumra. So perhaps you could say by the Rambam, that's what I heard once. I don't know if it's accurate, that the Rambam was the world of Chochmeh. In Elam HaChochmeh is Netshayach Kishuf and Shindalit. Chochmeh is not Shevel, such a thing. It comes from a world that's beyond Chochmeh, beyond Seichel. Since the Rambam is talking from the world of Teira, Seichel HaTeira, Shtip Nishta Zazach. That perhaps that's why the Rambam says what he says. So I wanted to get an issue from the Rebbe on that. But the Rebbe never responded to that. I'm just pointing that out. We could say possibly, if it's true that the Rebbe did say that the Rambam does talk in the world of Das, Leida, Sheyesha Motzei Yalala Das, Shehu Eine Motzei. So he's also hinting to even Das can come to a point of understanding that Eibush is higher than Motzei. And both together create that transformation that I was describing earlier. So here we are, the 39th Siyum, the beginning of the 40th. And when you think of it in the context of the Rebbe as a Nosi Ador, Nosi of Chabad, and continuing, obviously, the goal of your Futsu Meinesecha Chutza, to bring the Ma'anis of Chassidus, so Primis HaTeira Chutza. So some places Chutza includes Nigla de Teira, because the Fierech, Pnimis, it's Chutza. Not Chaz v'Sholem Chutz in a negative way, it's the chutz of the pnim. You need both together. It's a neshama and a guf. Neshmasa daraisa, gufa daraisa. That the Rebbe through the Rambam, of course, including everything else that the Rebbe was megala, machadish, and innovated and introduced us to, brings together the ultimate joining and fusion of pnimis and nigla, of neshama and guf in Teira, and of course, neshama and guf also in our Aveda, which is the ultimate goal. When the Rebbe says that the Berurim, the time of Aveda Saberurim, that we finished the Aveda Saberurim, what does it essentially mean? That halacha has done its job. That the halachas that were kept and upheld for generations and generations have accumulated, because we believe everything continues on. Chaz v'shalom, nothing ends. It accumulated to the point that it's ready to erupt. In the words of the Rebbe, one more act, in the words of the Rebbe quoting the Rambam, one more Maisa Echad, Dibur Echad, Machshava Achas, Kiba Machriya Kol Ha'elam Kulei, Lekaf Schus, and maybe Tshuva V'Atzola to him, to the person, and to Kol Ha'elam Kulei. The Gula Mitis Vashlema. So we should be Zeichet, the Schus of this Siyum Rambam, and so many others happening around the world. And the Rebbe's Takana has been spreading more and more. It still needs work. We still need Amol Oretz Deis Hashem Kaimayim Le'yam Mechasim. That we should be able to take all these halachas, including, of course, the Rebbe quoting the halacha of the Rambam, only in the Rambam, Seif Perek Ches of Hilchos Malachim, to reach even Bnei Neach, even the non-Jews, the way you can reach them, that which is shaykh to Sheva Mitzvahs Didhu, the things that relate to them. And that's what the Rambam brings at the end, in halacha, in the end of Seif Mishneh Torah, that he doesn't just talk about Eden. Talks about all the people will be lo yesa kol elam el ladasas Hashem bovad. Then he says that the Eden will be chachomim v'nevenim, and ultimately mola oretz deis Hashem kamayim le'yam mechasm is kol oretz, not just the Yiddish artists, not just the Jews, the entire world. And hopefully now, in this tkufa where we're going through our own disruptions, and everything is a ayin be'emtza between a yesh and a yesh, that we should finally be zeicher with this Sima Rambam, going into Arboim Shana. That's when the Eden go into Eretz Yisrael. Leiv Ladas, ayin lires, that we're ready to actually march in together with the Rebbe, together with the Rambam, together with all the neshamas of all those that were Moshe Nefesh and gave their lives in transforming this world, and really appreciate this Rambam revolution that the Rebbe initiated. And I'm sure there's much more depth and many more levels that when you really ma'ayin, you can discover more reasons. And at the end of the day, there are things maybe we'll never understand. That's how it is. But what we could understand, we try to understand in appreciating how the Rambam is a part and parcel, and an integral part of the big plan of the Deir HaShvi of finally bringing the Shechina da lamata, asara tvachim. You should have it in that full Dira b'tachtenim, the Gula Hamitis v'Ashlema, and together with everyone, we should be able to march to Yerushalayim HaKadosh, and Eretz HaKadosh, and Yerushalayim HaKadosh, Beis HaMikdash HaShlishi, with the Rebbe and leading us. Thank you very much, and should be only B'sudas Tevis. Everyone should be well and healthy, and we should take a march to the Gula even before the 3 weeks end, or even before this weekend. Thank you again.